Well, it was lovely. Totally unexpected, and of course, there's always lots of competition for prizes like that. Um, I've had other books that have won other prizes, but this one was particularly it was particularly great because it came from the historians of British Columbia. The BC Historical Federation, of course, is a group of the historians who tell the story of British Columbia in various places, often quite small little archives or museums, the kinds of places that Wilson thought were very valuable in terms of presenting and telling the story of the history of British Columbia. So that was really neat. And to go up to Princeton for the dinner and receive the award from the former lieutenant governor it was a lovely evening. You know, it was also really gratifying because it's an award for Wilson's story. I mean, the book's about Wilson. As I said at the event, I'm just the teller. It's Wilson's story, and to have his story recognized uh, in today's world, I think is really important. It's kind of neat to be doing this interview here on this coast because this is the coastline that Wilson loved, and the people of the coast. And so his story with working with those people is important to tell. And certainly it was an era when the settler population was not listening to First Nations people, and in all kinds of venues. Um, you know, the material that was in the museum, his advocacy for Northwest Coast art, his advocacy and role in land claims cases, and in all those ways, he was trying to understand First Nations people and cultures and then convey that understanding to a largely uncomprehending at that stage settler population. So, you know, alas, I suppose you would say, at that time, a bridge was necessary. Um, Nowadays, not so much, partly because of the progress that he and others made at that time. First Nations people are much more being heard in their own account rather than needing non-First Nations people to speak for them. But in those days, it was necessary. Um, and Wilson very much took on that role. He was a bridge between two cultural islands where there wasn't much communication going on. I mean, even his work on salvaging and restoring totem poles was treated with huge skepticism in the non-First Nations community, seen as basically a waste of time and money. But he pursued that and saved some of those poles for future artists to see and understand. But that kind of work today would be pretty readily seen as appropriation. We're looking at all that kind of work in a totally different way these days. But Wilson's role was necessary then in order for us to get to where we are now, I think. And when Robert Davidson in 1969 went up to Masset and carved and raised the first totem pole that had been raised on Haida Gwaii in like a couple of generations, 80 years. I mean, we forget that there were very few poles left when Wilson was salvaging and restoring them. But that pole raising in 1969, Wilson was there and just saw it as hugely significant that was starting to happen again. Because he'd said, and he understood the role of museums. He once said, kids from Masset can see Haida poles in New York, but they can't see them in Masset. And that pole raising, now the first of now many, was just hugely significant for him. Well, the coming back subtitle is there's a few layers to that. Wilson believed in reincarnation, and I had an interesting time getting my head around that. I had to learn about that and admit to the possibility. But Wilson believed in reincarnation, partly because of his close contact with First Nations people who also had that belief. And so Wilson thought that death was simply the doorway to the next life. He's very clear about that. And I think that belief partly facilitated for Wilson the manner of his passing. He took his own life, but he thought it was just the first one, and there would be another one to follow. So Wilson Duff coming back has that significance. I also thought that Wilson Duff coming back had to do with the book itself and telling Wilson's story, hopefully in a way that people can now read, listen to that story and see its significance for us today. I think Wilson needed to be understood in his context of the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and then think about what that means for today. So, things like reconciliation didn't start in our generation. People were trying to do it, but in different ways, years ago. So Wilson Duff coming back is also about his contribution coming back and being understood again. So at least in those two ways, that was the significance of the subtitle.